Hey guys, Chris here and I'm back with another skateboard video. This time we're going to be looking at the boosted board Stealth versus the Exway X1. Now the Exway X1 I've had for quite a few months. I've ridden it past 100 miles. The boosted is still relatively quite new to me, but I'm just about to hit 80 miles in it, even though I've only had it since December. It's been very cold, but I've been riding the hell out of it. Now I feel that puts me in a position to have a good insight into the way these boards perform, especially against each other, since I literally went from riding the Exway straight onto the boosted. So what I wanted to do was create this VS video, give you guys some feedback on how each of these boards performs. So if you're trying to figure out which one of them you should go for, hopefully this will clear that up and shed a bit of insight into if it's worth either going for the board that costs, if you're in North America, $799 US, or if you're in the UK, £749, versus the boosted Stealth, which costs $1,599 US, excluding taxes depending on where you're buying it from. And if you're looking at it from the UK, it's £1,499. So the boosted Stealth is literally double, not even figuratively, literally double, give or take £2, the cost of the Exway. So what's the difference between these two boards and which one is worth the spend? To be able to go through this video, what I wanted to do was split all of the differences into categories, and the order of these categories is going to be based on what I think is the most important feature of a skateboard. Now this is in my opinion, so of course it might be very, very different for yourselves, so just bear that in mind. Speed. Now the first and most important category to me is going to be speed. When I'm buying one of these boards, I want to figure out which one is the fastest. I want to get something that's going to be very quick, because although I live in the UK and we notoriously have bad roads here, I live in Cambridge. There's a lot of cycle tracks which tend to have quite smooth roads, and the route that I take from work to home when I get off the train is going to be pretty much along a cycle path. It's probably about 1.4, 1.6 miles long. It's completely straight and it's very, very smooth, and it's right next to a river. So it's a lot of fun being able to take a board to its top speed along that route. And when I'm trying to get into work, because this is predominantly how I get into work with these boards, it's nice to be able to open up the board and see exactly how fast it goes. So that's why speed's important to me. And at the end of the day, I want to clear that cycle track as quickly as I can and get into the office and start working. Now with the Exway, it's advertised at being able to do a top speed of 25 miles an hour. I said in my review, if you've not seen it, I'll link it down below. On multiple occasions, I was able to exceed 25 miles an hour. It's a very, very fair speed estimate that they've given the board. I've been able to go well past 25 miles an hour on multiple occasions, and it's nice and refreshing when a skateboard company actually puts a top speed that is achievable on a board. To me, there's nothing more frustrating than seeing a top speed that is completely unachievable unless you are a super lightweight rider on absolute perfect roads in absolute perfect weather conditions, which is just not realistic. So it's nice when a realistic top speed is put on a board and you're actually able to hit it. With the boosted board, it's advertised at being able to do 24 miles an hour. Now, of course, in case you're wondering which one of these is faster, because on paper the boosted does 1 mile an hour less or slower than the Exway, the boosted's still faster. It's the same thing again, where the speed that's been put down is very, very easy to blow past. It's not difficult to get past 24 miles an hour on the boosted board. It just depends on where you're riding. And for me, it depends on what I'm carrying on my back. If you've seen videos from Ricky, who's the other YouTuber that I film videos with, his channel will be linked down below. He rides the Exway, I ride a booster, and on occasions we're going to race. We're going to try little drag races on cycle tracks and smooth roads that we have. And when I'm carrying a bag on my back, and just normally I probably am maybe sort of 12 to 15 kilograms heavier than Ricky, the bag that I normally carry on my back can be anywhere from sort of 6 to 10 kilograms. So that's a lot of extra weight that I'm carrying. And when we do race, the Exway is more than capable of keeping up with the boosted, but the further down the road you get, the more the boosted starts to creep ahead. If I'm racing without a bag on my back, the boosted is clearly faster than the Exway, but the Exway can keep up, which is incredibly surprising when you think about the price difference between these two boards. One thing that I've personally found, again this is in my experience, with the hub motors of the Exway board, there isn't really a delay in how quickly the board gets its power, whereas the Boost It being belt driven, it needs a few seconds for it to be able to pick up a pace. That's one of the reasons why the Exway pulls forward and then the Boost It has to kind of catch it up, which is very, very surprising. But in terms of flat out which one is the quicker board, the Boost It Stealth is definitely faster. Something I've definitely got to mention is you notice a massive, massive depletion in the performance and top speed of the Exway as you start to work your way through the battery life. This didn't really stand out to us when we were both riding Exway boards, because I guess this was happening at the same time to both of our boards, so we didn't really feel a drop in the board's performance. But when Ricky was riding the Exway and I was riding the Boost It, if I got to say 70% of the Boost It's battery life, I was still able to hit pretty much top speed. I didn't notice any difference in the torque of the board, but the Exway essentially couldn't even keep up with the Boost It board after we dropped past 90% of the Exway's battery life. So that's definitely worth mentioning. As the Boost It loses its battery life, you don't really notice a drop in the board's performance until the battery's very low. But as the Exway loses its battery life, you notice a difference in the board's performance in the top speed. Almost immediately you cross past 90% of the board's battery. Range. Now from there, it's going to be the range. Now this is definitely going to be an important one, depending on what sort of a distance you need to be able to ride. The Exway has a suggested range of 10 miles. Now, we always ride these boards in the fastest mode that they can possibly do. It's just the way that we prefer to ride them. And we've never been able to even come close to 10 miles in the Exway. We're typically hitting anywhere from 5 to 6 miles in the Exway, and if you're really, really going for it, anywhere from sort of 4 to 5 miles. Now, whereas that might sound quite restricting to some people, for me that's actually quite ideal. I don't really ever ride a board more than 5 miles in one go. I'll always stop, have lunch, have a drink, and it means that it gives you more than enough time to be able to charge the board up and then get going again. Now with a Boost It board, it has an advertised range of 14 miles, but of course that's going to be based off of riding under optimal conditions and not in hyper mode, which is the fastest mode that the Boost It board goes. Hyper mode is pretty much the only mode I use, unless I'm very low on battery, which very rarely happens, but I'll always keep the board in hyper mode. And I did a range test in this board and I was able to get 8.3 miles out of it, only riding in hyper mode with that bag on my back that's between 6 to 8 kilograms, depending on what I put inside it. So I was very surprised at that. Now, of course, I've got to mention, I wasn't going flat out down a road at 25, 26 miles an hour the entire time and I got 8.3 miles. I was riding around Cambridge City, so of course there was a lot of situations where I'd have to slow down, I'd have to follow the speed of traffic, but the board was able to hit 8.3 miles, and I wasn't taking it easy. If there was an opportunity for me to full throttle the board, I did every single occasion I got, but that's typically what you can expect to get out of the board, riding around a fairly congested city, which in my opinion is fantastic. With the Exway, the range is probably the only thing that lets it down. If you really are going for it, sort of getting between 4 to 5 miles out of the board isn't bad, but it would be great to be able to see more range out of the board. But of course, because this board charges in essentially just over an hour from a completely dead battery to a full battery, that's definitely a win, but the range is definitely going to be slightly restricting. Ride. Now the ride is definitely going to be another place that you can see a lot of differences with these two boards. Now because of the Boost It board and its incredibly flexy deck, the fact that it doesn't have hub motors, it's belt-driven motors, so the rear wheels aren't really, really thin, they're nice and thick. In terms of the hardness or softness of the wheels, the Boost It board has 78A wheels, which makes a very big difference on the road. It means that it's able to go over little stones and chips in the ground a lot easier than a wheel that was much, much harder, and it's definitely something that you notice. The general shape of the deck, the wheels, the trucks, the way that the deck flexes, when you're riding it, it's incredibly comfortable, it's very planted, and I've got to say, I think that's where you really feel the money that you spend on this board. It's in the ride. It's definitely different to the Exway and pretty much any other board that I've ridden, because this is the most expensive board that I've ridden up until this point. Saying that, something I was worried about when I saw the Boost It board was going to be the casing for the battery over here, and also the housing at the bottom that holds all of the other electronic components that the Boost It board requires. Going off curbs or riding across really bad roads, I thought this was going to get really badly scratched. But you can see after having done almost 80 miles in the Boost It board, it has absolutely no scratches on the base of the board, which is very surprising. The trucks are a little bit scratched up, the deck of course is a little bit scratched, but the actual body of the board, the belly of the board I could say, is completely fine, which is very, very surprising. I thought this was going to get really scratched, so that's a nice surprise. Now with the Exway, it has the battery and all of those components built into the actual deck, so it's very stiff. There's essentially no flex on the deck of the Exway board. Because of the rear wheels being hub motors, it means that the actual rubber around the wheel is very thin on the rear versus the front, which is nice and chunky, as you'd expect with a normal longboard. But that has, of course, an effect on the way the board feels when you're riding it. It means that when you're going over less than desirable surfaces, for me, one thing I noticed is the white lines you get on roads. If you kind of swerve in between those, you can really feel the bump or the motion of going over them, which kind of can not throw you off balance, but it makes you feel a bit weird as you're going over the top of them. It comes as a bit of a surprise, especially riding the Boost It, then going back onto the Exway. So the ride between these boards is definitely completely different. Not in necessarily a bad way, because when I was riding the Exway and I'd gone from riding Slick Revolutions boards, there wasn't really that much of a difference. It just kind of worked and it felt great. But riding the Boost It and then going back to the Exway, there is a massive difference in the way that they feel. I feel a lot more stable, a lot more secure on the Boost It. And there's other little things that make that difference as well, because the wheels on the Exway are 80A, so they're a little bit harder, but it makes a difference. And they're also a little bit more narrow. The Boost It has slightly wider wheels, so it has a greater point of contact with the road, which breaks down to 56 millimeters of contact with the road versus the Boost It's 59 millimeters. Now that doesn't sound like a big difference, but when you're riding around, especially in damp conditions, that's where you really notice it. You just feel like you're more stable, you're less likely to slip out with the Boost It versus the Exway board. Now, all of this, of course, has an effect on your confidence, on how willing you are to go out, depending on how hairy the conditions are outside. But the ride is 100% something that you notice, and it's where that margin in price is really felt. Now, when it comes time to charge these boards, the Exway, I've got to say, does charge a little bit faster, even without the quick charger, which is something that they offer that we've not picked up yet. With a completely flat battery, the Exway will charge in about an hour and a half. Sometimes it's a little bit quicker, sometimes it's a little bit slower. The Boost It board is just over an hour and a half from a completely flat battery all the way back up to 100%. Now this is, again, I'll touch on this in more details later in the video, but the Boost It board actually sends you a notification to my Apple Watch and to my phone when my battery's low, and also when my battery's done charging, which I think it's a little gimmicky, but honestly, it's freaking awesome. Sat there in a restaurant, having a drink, having a burger, and your watch goes off, you look at it, and it's just good news, your Boost It board's done charging. I think that's a really nice touch, and it's where you start to see the difference in price coming into play when you're looking at the little attention to detail that Boost It offer in comparison to other boards. Spares. Now, spare parts is definitely something that I don't think is considered enough when you buy a board. The way I like to think of this is, if somebody was to gift me with a Bugatti, I'd love it. It's probably one of my favorite cars, but if somebody gave me that car for free, I could not afford to keep the car on the road. The servicing cost, the wheels, God knows what other maintenance goes into having a car like that, but I genuinely wouldn't be able to afford it. And if you're pressed for cash but you want to buy a Boost It board, you're able to finally get one. You need to bear in mind the accessories that you might want to consider for it. Me personally, because Boost It is located in California, I want to essentially make sure I have a replacement part for everything on the board that I'm able to buy, which means all of the wheels, if I'm able to pick up the motors, which isn't really something I think that they offer unless something breaks. Of course, the belts, because this is a belt-driven board, so you need to have replacement belts. You get 2 inside the box, but I'd like to have at least 6 or 8, just to safeguard me so I don't have to wait for weeks should anything go wrong. The skid guards, essentially everything that this board has that is a consumable part, I want to make sure that I have extra, especially bearings, the chargers, and also the remote for it. After I put everything into my cart to be able to buy all of the spares I needed for the Boost It board, it totaled at more than $400, which honestly was a massive surprise to me. So all of the extras that you need for this board are expensive. The wheels, all 4 wheels came to $139 alone. That's insane. The Exway spare wheels, and even the bigger ones, which are 85mm as opposed to 83, which is what I have, were $35. There is a big difference between the cost of the accessories between these two boards. The little things like the charger for the Exway was $60, the remote was $88, which is cheaper. The remote has a screen on it, the Boost It board's remote doesn't. The Boost It board's remote was $100. Little things like that really come into play, so make sure that you consider those accessories and those extras that you need for the board, aside from just the cost of the board, because you are going to need them. The last thing I want is to need to replace a wheel, have to order it for it to be shipped from California, and wait 2 to 3 weeks for it to arrive. They do have them in the UK, and the pricing for Boost It boards accessories are very, very similar, but I thought I'd do them in US dollars just to safeguard anyone that's watching from the rest of the world. This is an American board at the end of the day. Technically so is this, so it means that you'd be more familiar with hopefully seeing the prices in US dollars. But of course, what I'm going to do is link the accessory pages for both the Boosted Stealth and also the Exway X1 down below in the video description, so you can check out the costs yourself to figure out if you want to spend the money on the Exway and some accessories, or you're happy to spend the money on the Boosted Board Stealth and some of its accessories. Features. Now, features or attention to detail in both of these boards is something that needs to be considered. The Exway has a lot of standout features that you wouldn't expect a board of its price point to have. Now, if you're familiar with MagSafe chargers on MacBook Pros, they essentially have a magnetic strip, so the charger and the port that it needs to go into attract each other. It's really sweet because it means that if you trip over the cable, the MagSafe will disconnect, or if you're trying to plug it in, it's very easy to plug in. The Exway board has that feature on the charger port, which it makes it really, really nice and comfortable to be able to attach the charger to it. And when you pull the charger out, the little rubber case or guard that goes over the charger port automatically flips back and closes. So it's little attention to detail like that that you do notice with the board, and it is nice. That's not something that the Boosted board features. It's a standard rubber tab that you have to pull and reattach yourself. It's a little bit finicky, a little bit fiddly, but it works. It's not something I'm going to complain about. Having a MagSafe style plug for this would be pretty cool, but it's not something that's featured. Something else is also, both of these boards have apps. Essentially, the apps do the same thing. Boosted Board's app lets you configure your build, your profile, a little bit more than the Exway's does, which is always nice. But the Exway's has a feature that I think the Boosted Board is lacking, and that's the ability to really tweak the way that the remote performs, what the remote's able to do. For example, you can use the scroll wheel on the Exway's remote. If you scroll back, it'll break, but you can also change it in the settings to scroll back and have the board reverse. Now, this brings us swiftly onto probably the biggest negative of the Boosted board. When you scroll back on the remote on the Boosted board, holding down the dead man switch, the board goes backwards as quickly as it can go forwards. This sounds great. In reality, it's not, for me personally. There's occasions that I just want the board to stop and stay there, or if you need to stop in a hurry and you scroll the wheel all the way back, you know those wheels are going to be firing backwards. That was something that took me a while to adjust to. I really do feel that in the settings, Boosted should let you turn that off so you can just scroll back and brake. Another thing is the board has a deadman switch. The Boosted Board Stealth has a deadman switch. The Exway X1 doesn't have a deadman switch. I mentioned in my review that it's annoying not having the deadman switch. If the board is on and you accidentally hit the scroll, it goes flying off and there's nothing that you can do. The Boosted doesn't have that issue, but one thing that it doesn't do is brake while the deadman switch is not activated, because essentially brake isn't brake, brake is reverse. I personally feel that the board should brake if you scroll backwards, not reverse, just brake if you're not holding the deadman switch. Sometimes you're coasting and you might need to stop, and then you quickly have to scramble to grab the deadman switch and then scroll backwards gently to brake, because if you do it too aggressively, the board's going to go flying backwards and you're going to go flying forwards. That's probably one of the biggest things that you need to get used to if you've not been on a board that reverses when you scroll the wheel backwards. But now, on the flip side, there is a benefit to that. If I'm going down a bridge or a very steep hill and I need to brake, the Exway or any other board that I've ridden, and I have about 6 or 7 electric longboards back there, none of them have actually come to a complete stop. You brake and you hold the brake all the way back, the board will still slowly drift down the hill, sometimes at quite a lot of speed depending on what board you're on. But because the Boosted board doesn't essentially have a brake, it only has a reverse gear, it means when you do scroll backwards, you can actually get the board to completely stop, even going down an incredibly steep hill, which is a massive, massive benefit. So it's a catch-22 whereby I'd love the board to be able to just stop and not go backwards, but there is occasions where the board being able to go backwards or stop so aggressively because the wheels are rotating backwards is actually an advantage. So it's one of those things that you've got to get used to and take it with a pinch of salt. Sometimes it's a blessing and sometimes it's a curse. Now this brings us on to both of the remotes of these boards. Now Boosted's remote is very signature. Of course, it's been copied by a lot of different companies. All it has is the board indication battery lights along the top, so you can see what the battery level on the board is. It's got the battery level of the remote. If you see it flashing orange, it needs to be charged. Red, it's going to die at any point. And then of course it has the Bluetooth connection between the actual board and the remote itself. So it's very, very simple. It would be nice if it had a screen for us to be able to see how fast you were going, to be able to adjust settings, but that's all done from the app. You can also adjust the speed mode that you're in, depending on how many times you press the button on the Boosted board remote. But as it stands, very, very simple. Scroll wheel on the top, which has a really, really nice feel to it. It's not too stiff, it's not too slippery. It's really easy to control the board with it, and a dead man switch, as I touched on earlier. And now with the Exway's remote, there is no dead man switch. There's just one button and a screen and the scroll wheel. The scroll wheel, of course, forwards is forwards, backwards is brake, not reverse, but you can change it in the settings on the app if you do want it to reverse as you brake. I like the fact that this does have a screen, so you can glance down and see how fast you're going, or just change very basic settings on the actual remote. Check the battery with an actual LED screen. Something I will mention is that the battery indication on the Exway, I don't feel is as accurate as the booster boards. If the booster board says you have 2 bars of battery left, and that's going to get you, for example, 3 miles down the road, depending on what mode you're in, that is honestly how far you are going to get. But with the Exway, if it says that you have 1 bar of battery and it's estimating that you'll be able to do X amount of range, that's not always accurate. Whereas the Boost It, I've found, is incredibly accurate with its battery readouts on the board and also on the remote, which is definitely a bonus. But aside from that, both of these remotes, they are good. The Boost It board's remote is very plasticky, very slippery, whereas the Exway's is very tactile, very rubbery. It does show scratches very easily, but it is very comfortable and nice to hold. That's pretty much all there is to it regards to the remotes of both of these boards. Look. Now that brings us on to the look of both of these boards. It has to be said, everything about the Boost It board feels and looks premium. From the composite deck that mimics the way the Bamboo decks felt, the housing along the battery casing, along all of the electronic components down below, the board just looks and feels great. It's also very well balanced. If you're holding this board along the middle of the deck, it's completely balanced. It's very comfortable to hold as you're going in and out of trains or up steps, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but there's been some brush motor boards that I've used before that, because of all the electronic components, the motor housing at the bottom of the board, it means that the bottom is way heavier than the top and it's very uncomfortable to hold them. This is balanced so well and it feels really great to hold. It looks fantastic. Even the battery indication lights look awesome. Everything about the Boost It board screams premium. Even the fact that the trucks have Boosted engraved into the base of them. That's completely unnecessary, but it looks incredible. Now when we move on to the Exway, there isn't much to say because it just looks low profile, it looks sleek, everything's built into the deck. So all you effectively see is the on-off button, a charge port which is covered by a magnetic strip, and then the hub motor wheels, which essentially just look like chunky wheels, and the front wheels, that's it. It's very slick, it's very nice, but there isn't much to say about it. It doesn't feel cheap in any way, shape or form, but because everything is so hidden and so low key, there isn't much to say about it. But the Boost It board looks like something out of the future, which for me is a bonus. Build. Now, when we look at the build of both of these boards, again, everything's hidden over here. We've had no issues with cracking, as I've seen in some forums, of the deck. This thing has been up and down half pipes around skate parks, up and down curbs, no cracking, no major damage whatsoever. The board is held up incredibly well. The Boost It board, I've not taken this up half pipes. That's not something that I'd want to do in a Boost It board. But again, I've been dropping down off of curbs, nothing too crazy. I've ridden this thing all around central London, all around Cambridge, even in the Netherlands, in Den Haag. Absolutely no issues with it. It's been phenomenal. The build quality of the Boost It board, as I said, with the look, it just feels premium. Everything that on some boards that I've had before that's normally made from plastic is made from metal on the Boost It board. It just feels solid. Nothing about this board feels cheap, which is always a bonus, especially when you're spending that kind of money on a skateboard. But in terms of the overall build quality, it's hard to compare because this is a hub motor board, so the motors are inside it. We've not had any issues with brakes or anything needing to be replaced, so I'd say the durability is quite good. But again, same with the Boost It board. Although it's a belt-driven board that has all of the motors exposed on the outside, there's been no issues, no breaking down, no scratching of the motors themselves. There's a couple of stone chips on them just from going very quickly on less than savory roads, but aside from that, they both look good. They've both held up very well in terms of what we've put them through. So it's hard to compare the durability of both of these boards, but Boost It is definitely premium, and Exway has been fending off the amount of abuse it's received very well. Weather. Now, a very big decider in which one of these two boards you should go for is going to be the water resistance of each of these boards. The Exway X1, I've seen videos online of this thing going through a swimming pool, completely submerged in water, came out the other end, the board is completely fine. Numerous occasions I've ridden this board through massive puddles, torrential rain, numerous occasions, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the board whatsoever. The Boost It board, although it is water sealed, Boost It really do not like their boards being ridden in the wet. We see it on YouTube all the time, riders riding these things in the wet. I wouldn't recommend it. I'd never recommend riding in the wet, but you can get caught out, especially if you live somewhere like England, and you do sometimes need to ride the board home in the wet. The Exway is definitely the one that I would go for if riding in the rain or riding in wet is something that I needed to do frequently. Whereas the Boost It, although you can do that with this board, I personally wouldn't want to do it. The Exway is LP55 rated, so it can really handle water quite well. The Boost It, being water sealed, can handle water, but I would feel sketchy riding a board that costs £1,499 in the wet. Although I've done it in moderate rain, I wouldn't really go above that. I'd just get a taxi. So that's a really big one. And if water resistance is important to you, it's really undebatable. I'd go for the Exway. If you're going to be riding your board in the wet a lot, the Exway is the one that you want to go for, because I've done that and I know the Exway can handle it. Versus the Boost It board, I personally wouldn't dare doing it in the Boost It. Now, if you're trying to figure out which one of these boards to go for, look at that list that I broke down in this video, the categories. Figure out which ones are the most important for yourself, rearrange them and put them in that order. Thank you very much for watching this video all the way to the end. If it was helpful for you figuring out which one of these two boards is the better one, depending on what your preferences are, please give the video a thumbs up and please consider subscribing, because I will be posting more skateboard related content. If there's anything that you feel that I missed or any questions that you have on either of these boards, please leave your comments down below and I will answer them as quickly as I can. But I'm going to be posting an individual review of the Boost It board because there's still a lot of things that I want to talk about this board, and there's a lot of other skateboards that we're going to be featuring on this channel very, very soon. But thank you for watching. Please thumbs up and subscribe, and I will catch you in the next video. Thank you and take care. And quick side note, if you want either of these boards, if you're in North America or in the UK, the links will be down below. Thank you and take care till next time.